You're standing at the edge of a pit, and the sound rises before you see them. A dry, ancient hissing that seems to come from the earth itself. Your hands are bound. Your armor is gone. Below you, the serpents move like water, coiling over one another, and you realize in this moment that death will not be quick. It will not be honorable. You will die slowly, venom flooding your veins, while your enemies watch from above, their faces carved from stone and satisfied cruelty. This was not imagination. This was history. Before we descend further into these shadows, I have to pause and say, I'd genuinely love to know where in the world you're watching from right now. It absolutely amazes me that stories this dark, this old, can still reach across oceans and centuries to find us wherever we are. The Viking Age spanned roughly 300 years, from the late 8th century to the mid-11th, and we remember it for longships cutting through fog, for warriors who believed death in battle was the only path to eternal glory. But that version, the romanticized saga, conceals something far more disturbing. Beneath the myths of Valhalla and the poetry of the Skalds lies a world where death was not only expected but engineered, where executions were designed not just to kill, but to communicate, to terrorize, to inscribe a power onto the human body in ways so brutal that chronicles written centuries later still tremble with the weight of what they recorded. This is not a story about heroism. This is an excavation of the Viking Age's darkest rituals, where death became theater, punishment became legend, and suffering was written into history with blood and ceremony. What follows are the most horrifying deaths ever documented from that era, moments so visceral that medieval scribes, no strangers to violence themselves, paused in their writing to acknowledge the sheer scale of cruelty they were preserving. These are not tales whispered around fires for entertainment. These are records, testimonies, warnings carved into the spine of history itself, and they begin with a king thrown into serpents. Ragnar Lodbrok, if he existed as history claims or myth insists, was a name that made coastal villages lock their doors. By the mid-9th century, his raids along the coasts of England and Francia had become legendary for their speed and savagery. But in 865 CE, according to the Ragnarssona Thater and Saxo Grammaticus's Gesta Danorum, Ragnar's luck shattered against the shores of Northumbria. His fleet was destroyed by a storm, his men scattered or slaughtered, and Ragnar himself was captured by King Ella, a monarch who had watched his kingdom burn too many times under Viking torches. Ella did not grant Ragnar a warrior's death. Instead, he ordered the construction of a pit, deep, narrow, inescapable, and filled it with serpents. Not metaphorical ones. Actual venomous snakes, likely adders, native to the English countryside and abundant in the marshlands of Northumbria. Ragnar was stripped of his weapons, his armor, every symbol of the warrior he had been. Then he was lowered into the pit alive. Imagine the sensory assault. The smell of damp earth and reptile musk. The hissing, layered and constant, echoing off stone walls. The first strike would have been sharp, then burning, then another, and another. Snake venom works in stages. Neurotoxins begin shutting down nerve function, causing paralysis, blurred vision, difficulty breathing. Hemotoxins destroy tissue, causing internal bleeding and organ failure. Depending on the number of bites and the concentration of venom, Ragnar could have remained conscious for hours, trapped in a body that was shutting down piece by piece, surrounded by creatures that saw him only as threat or prey. The sagas claim his final words were defiant. How the little pigs would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffers. Whether he actually said this, we cannot know. But the line endured because it captured something essential about Viking identity, and refusal to beg, even when death was designed to humiliate. Ragnar's execution was not random cruelty, it was calculated. Ella wanted to break not just the man, but the myth. to show that even the most feared Viking could die without glory, without Valhalla, writhing in dirt and venom. But the plan backfired catastrophically, because Ragnar had sons. And in 866 CE, those sons returned. They brought with them what the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle grimly calls the Great Heathen Army, a coalition of Viking warbands united not by conquest, but by vengeance. They swept through Northumbria like a fire through dry timber. By late 866, they had taken Eoforwick, the city we now call York. King Ella was captured, and what happened next became one of the most debated and horrifying executions in medieval history. They gave him the blood eagle. The Orkneyinga saga and Heimskringla both reference this ritual, though scholars argue endlessly about whether it was literal or poetic. But the Norse sources are disturbingly specific. The victim was placed face down. The ribs were cut away from the spine with an axe or blade. Then, one by one, the ribs were pulled outward and broken, splayed open like wings. In some accounts, the lungs were then pulled through the opening, left to flutter with each dying breath, hence the name Blood Eagle. This was not an execution. It was a sacrament of rage. The Blood Eagle was reserved for the worst offenders, oathbreakers, kinslayers, those who violated the deepest codes of Norse honor. By subjecting Ella to it, Ragnar's sons were making a statement that echoed across kingdoms. Our father's suffering will be answered with yours, magnified, ritualized, made eternal in saga and memory. Whether Ella truly died this way remains uncertain. Some historians argue the blood eagle was a literary invention, a metaphor for being carved by swords. Others point to the consistency of the descriptions across multiple sagas and the existence of similar ritualized violence in other cultures. What is certain is this: the story of Ella's death was told and retold, and in the telling, it became a warning. Cross the Norsemen, and your death will not be private. It will be public, symbolic, and so terrible that chroniclers centuries later will still struggle to describe it. But Viking cruelty was not reserved for kings and warriors alone. In 870 CE, on the windswept coast of what is now Scotland, a monastery stood overlooking the North Sea. St. Ebb's Abbey at Coldingham was home to a community of nuns, women who had dedicated their lives to prayer, manuscript illumination, and the quiet rhythms of monastic discipline. But in the winter of that year, word reached the abbey that a Viking fleet had been sighted along the coast, moving south, raiding as they went. The abbess faced an impossible choice. She knew what happened to women captured by raiders: enslavement, forced concubinage, transport across the sea to Norse settlements where they would never see home again. And, so according to the Libellus de Exordio atque procursu istius, hoc est Dunhelmensis, Ecclesiae, she made a decision that still horrifies us nearly 12 centuries later. She gathered the nuns and told them what they must do. Then, in front of the entire community, she took a blade and cut off her own nose and upper lip, mutilating her face beyond recognition. And one by one, the other nuns followed. They disfigured themselves, destroying any trace of beauty or desirability, hoping that this act of self-sacrifice would render them worthless to the raiders, sparing them a fate they believed worse than death. When the Vikings arrived and saw what the women had done, they did not leave. They barred the doors of the monastery church from the outside. Then they set it on fire. The nuns burned alive inside. Those who had already mutilated themselves, those who were too young or too terrified to go through with it, and the abbess who had led them into that final, desperate act of defiance. The smoke would have been visible for miles. The screams shorter. This was not a battle. This was annihilation. The burning of St. Ebb's stands out not because it was the only monastery destroyed by Vikings, dozens were, but because of the layered horror it represents. The desperation that drove the nuns to disfigure themselves, the cold, methodical cruelty of the response, and the theological weight it carried for medieval Christians, who saw the event as both martyrdom and atrocity, a collision of faith and brutality that defied easy interpretation. It also reveals something crucial about Viking raiding culture. These were not spontaneous acts of bloodlust. They were calculated. The burning of a monastery sent a message to surrounding villages and kingdoms. Resistance is futile, and even sacred spaces offer no sanctuary. The Norsemen would not be bound by the rules of Christian warfare or the protections afforded to clergy under canon law. They operated outside that framework entirely, and that made them terrifying in a way that conventional armies were not. But perhaps no Viking-era death resonates more deeply in English memory than that of King Edmund of East Anglia, killed in the winter of 869 CE. Edmund was young, likely in his late 20s, and by all accounts a devout Christian king. When the great heathen army turned its attention to his kingdom, Edmund faced the same choice as every other ruler in their path: submit, flee, or fight. He chose to fight. And he lost. According to Passio Sancti Edmundi, written by Abbo of Fleury based on eyewitness testimony, Edmund was captured after a brief and brutal campaign. The Viking leaders, likely Ivar the Boneless and his brothers, offered him terms. Renounce Christ. Rule as a tributary king under Norse authority. Share your kingdom's wealth. Edmund refused. What followed was not an execution. It was a prolonged act of torture designed to break his will and make an example of his faith. They tied him to a tree. Then they began shooting arrows into his body, slowly, deliberately, avoiding vital organs. The Passio describes him as resembling a hedgehog with spines, his body bristling with shafts. Each arrow was a question. Will you renounce your God now? And each time, Edmund refused. The psychological dimension of this torture cannot be overstated. This was not a quick death in the chaos of battle. This was a man watching his own body destroyed, piece by piece, while his executioners mocked his faith and gave him repeated chances to save himself. And he did not take them. Finally, when the Vikings grew tired of the spectacle, they beheaded him and threw his severed head into the forest, denying him even the dignity of Christian burial. But the story didn't end there. Within days, according to local tradition, Edmund's followers found his head guarded by a wolf, a detail that may be hagiographic embellishment, but which speaks to the immediate mythologization of his death. His body was recovered, and he was buried at a site that would become Bury Saint, Edmund's, one of the most important pilgrimage destinations in medieval England. His martyrdom became a rallying point for Anglo-Saxon resistance, and his cult spread rapidly, transforming a Viking execution into a symbol of Christian endurance. From the Norse perspective, Edmund's death was strategic. It demonstrated that Christian kingship held no special immunity, that faith would not protect you from the realities of power. But from the English perspective, it was proof that martyrdom could be more powerful than survival. Edmund's refusal to renounce his faith turned him into a saint, and his death became a story that outlasted the Vikings themselves. These deaths, Ragnar's, Ella's, the nuns of St. Ebb's, King Edmund, were not isolated incidents. They were part of a broader culture in which death was ritualized, weaponized, and remembered. The Vikings understood something that modern societies often forget: how you kill matters. The manner of death sends a message. It establishes dominance, communicates values, and shapes the stories that future generations will tell. The blood eagle, the snake pit, the burning monastery. These were not simply acts of violence, they were performances. And the audience was not just the victim, but everyone who would hear the story afterward. Every village that learned of Ella's fate, every monastery that heard what happened at Coldingham, every Christian king who was told how Edmund died. The Vikings were writing their reputation in blood, and that reputation was a weapon as effective as any axe. But there was a cost. The sagas that preserved these stories also preserved the horror. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the Gesta Danorum, the Orkney Inga Saga, All of them recorded these deaths with a kind of grim precision, ensuring that the cruelty would not be forgotten. And over time, that memory became a liability. The Vikings who terrorized Europe in the 9th and 10th centuries were eventually converted, integrated, and absorbed into Christian kingdoms. But the stories remained, and those stories shaped how the Norse were remembered, not as traders or settlers or state builders, but as agents of chaos and cruelty. In the end, the Vikings' own weapon, terror, turned against them in the court of historical memory. But the question we're left with is this: were these deaths exceptional, or were they simply better documented? How many other executions, just as brutal, were lost because no chronicler was there to record them? How many bodies were thrown into rivers, buried in unmarked graves, or left to rot in fields without anyone to remember their names or the manner of their dying? We tell these stories because they survived. But survival is not the same as truth, and documentation is not the same as completeness. What we call Viking history is really just the fragments that made it through, the deaths that were too shocking, too symbolic, or too politically significant to be forgotten. And that, perhaps, is the final horror. Not just that these deaths happened, but that they are only the ones we know about. The serpents still hiss in the dark, the flames still burn, the arrows still fly, and somewhere in the unmapped spaces between saga and chronicle, other deaths remain unrecorded, waiting in silence for someone to remember them. But these, the snake pit, the blood eagle, the burning monastery, the arrow-pierced king, these we cannot forget. They were written into history with such force that even now, more than 1,000 years later, we feel the weight of them. We see the pit. We hear the hissing. We smell the smoke. And we understand, finally, that the Viking Age was not an age of heroes. It was an age of terror, recorded by those who survived it and preserved by those who could not look away.